Welcome to the Facts versus Feelings podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Detrick, and I'm joined by my co-host, Sonu Varghese. Cutting through the noise in 30 minutes each week with Ryan Detrick, Chief Market Strategist, and Sonu Varghese, VP Global Macro Strategist, taking out the boring and helping investors focus on what really matters. A quick note before we start the show. Investment advisory services offered through CWM LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Carson Partners, a division of CWM LLC, is a nationwide partnership of advisors. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 35th episode of Carson's Facts versus Feelings. Really special one here with Ryan and Sonu today. We're joined by Libby Cantrill. I believe, Libby, you're our first time second guest to the show. You're one of our first guests ever. With everything going on, we're so excited to have you back. Libby, before we get into it, what's your title one more time? And are you busy today?
Some stuff going on. Well, anyway, I'm honored to be your repeat guest. So thanks so much for having me back. I am Managing Director and Head of Public Policy at PIMCO.
Awesome. Right. And with everything going on, we know you're busy. We've got 30 minutes of your time, so we're just going to start firing away. Our advisors and their clients are so excited to learn so much of what's happening. Sonu, I think the first question is one she probably could talk the full 30 minutes on, but what's our first question for Libby? And again, thanks for joining us.
I was going to ask, where are we with the debt ceiling negotiations? But just to clarify for everyone listening, what is this debt ceiling thing we are talking about, right? Just to set that, is the overall picture here.
Right.
And why are we dealing with it? Right.
Yes. Well, that I think is even the bigger, that's a more apropos question. But of course, I mean, as you both know, and probably most of the listeners know at this point, just because it's been so well covered, but the debt limit is somewhat a kind of artificial manufactured limit that the U.S. has put on its amount of debt that it can issue. It is completely divorced, as probably people know, from the normal budget process, meaning that at this point, we are just issuing debt to pay for spending that we've already agreed to. And this is, depending on who's in power, is sort of the main talking point that, of course, these are bills that we have already run up. We just need to, because we do run a deficit, we just need to be able to issue debt to honor that spending that we have already committed to. Now, the question is, why are we even talking about this? That is a good question. And of course, it's because both parties, when they are out of power of the White House, often use any leverage that they can to get concessions that they can from the party in power. In this case, it's Democrats who are, of course, control the White House, and Republicans who control the House. They're trying to use this as leverage to get concessions on mostly on spending, which we'll talk about, but some other things as well. Now, both parties do this. Democrats have done this in the past. It just so happens that this is, at least in the last decade, has happened more when there's been a Democrat in the White House and a Republican-controlled House. So there we are. That's why we are dealing with this today. You can probably tell by the tone of my voice, though, that I'm over it. I have been in this role. I've been at PIMCO for 16 years. I've been in this public policy role for 13, and needless to say, have seen more sort of debt ceiling standoffs than I would like. So I really am sort of at the end of my tether. This is, for all intents and purposes, sort of a manufactured crisis on the parts of Congress.
I'll just jump in real fast.
Crisis, yeah.
Real fast. So you've hit your 7-year itch twice. Is that what you're telling us? After 13 years, you're getting about the 7-year itch twice. Yeah.
I will say my first, not that everyone wants to know, this, my first episode with this was, of course, in 2011 when this was more novel, right? When people really didn't sort of understand the debt ceiling. Nor sort of what was at stake. I happened to be 9 months pregnant, and Bill Gross happened to be our chief investment officer at the time, and so I found myself presenting in front of Bill many times on this issue, kind of going into the X date, which was at that point August of 2011. So fortunately, this is, I'm not pregnant, and this is a little bit easier because, for better or for worse, again, we've seen this movie before, whereas in 2011 it did feel more novel and more, and in some ways, more unknown.
I have to ask, this is not a question I all saw coming. So Bill Gross, I always heard he wore a tie but didn't tie it. He just like wore a tie. We're not talking bad. Just fact. Is that true? He just wore the tie but like didn't tie it around his neck. Is that at all true? I've heard this.
Yeah, it is, and actually, it's
okay.
hard. So when clients were around, he would tie it very quickly.
Oh,
but like
okay.
Today, he would sort of wear the tie around his neck. So an investment committee, he would just sort of wear it on the neck, sort of like a scarf.
Yes.
But then if a client were to come in, he would quickly tie it. So that was, I think that was the logic behind it.
And that is why that's why listeners come to the Facts versus Feeling podcast to learn how Bill Gross really wore his tie. So, well, Libby, let's just building on that. And I know this changes. We're doing this Tuesday afternoon. Hopefully, people hear this on Wednesday. Things haven't changed. Take this wherever you want to go. But what's the latest with the debt ceiling in Washington and wherever you want to take this one? But what are you seeing out there?
Well, so if you had spoken to me last week, I was much more optimistic. I mean, I should just say that we've been constructive for the last few months, not just for the last few months, that there will be a resolution in advance of the X date and that we will not default. We still have that view for sure. It's going to be a little bit more of a nail biter though than it looked like it was going to be last week. The status of negotiations last week was going pretty well. I think that, President Biden realizing that it was not tenable not to negotiate over this because, of course, while Democrats control the Senate, technically with the majority, they don't actually have a veto-proof majority or even filibuster-proof majority. And as a result, I think President Biden realized that he needed to negotiate with Republicans in the House, not only for it to pass the House, but also for it to pass the Senate as well. So, I think the negotiations were going quite well last week. Fast forward to this week, they've kind of gone sideways with President Biden being out of the country and honestly, folks on both sides of the aisle changing the terms of the negotiation. There's been sort of a contours of the deal that have existed basically for the last month or so. But both sides were starting to kind of add on like a Christmas tree, if you will, which is a Washington term, trying to get the different things on their Christmas tree. I do think it's positive that they've limited the scope of those negotiations as of today, Tuesday. I did just get an update though that it sounds like things did not go very well today. So we're hoping that they're going to be regrouping. They met all throughout last night. They met this morning. They're probably going to meet tonight again. But this may actually just come down to President Biden and Speaker McCarthy, being in a room with the staff and hashing it out because it does seem that McCarthy in particular wants to be dealing with the president. Who wouldn't? But he wants to deal with the president, So I would sort of long way of saying I think we were more optimistic last week that we would get this thing resolved, way in advance of the X date. Now it's looking like it may actually be a little bit more of a nail biter. We could even see a short-term extension as well in order to give negotiators more time. But again, we still have the high conviction that this will be resolved. It's just going to come down to the 11th hour.
Wow. So I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of specifics, but without just trying to keep it a little high level, what exactly are they negotiating over? I mean, what does each side want?
Yeah, so I could get into like the real wonky details, which I know, or we'll have all your listeners turn this podcast off, which we did not want.
No.
But really, I would say the crux of the issue is overspending and over what's called discretionary spending. Now, this is sort of a policy nuance, but it's important. There's discretionary spending, which Congress has control over. It's about $1.5 trillion. And then there's the rest of the budget, which is about $4.5 billion. So the part that Congress has control over is not very big, controlled to versus everything else, which is, of course, is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest expense. So it's about a quarter of the entire federal budget, but that's really what the issue is. Now, interestingly, Republicans don't want to cut defense spending. So of that 25%, it's only about 12.5% they actually want to move the needle. Whereas Democrats feel like if there are going to be any cuts, they should be apportioned equally between defense and non-defense spending. So that's kind of one issue. The other issue is, and this is going to be really wonky, I'm just going to say that's the baseline. What level are they going to be starting at? Democrats want just to freeze spending from 2023 and then grow it at a slower rate, whereas Republicans want to go back to 2022 spending, which would be sort of cuts and then grow it at a slower rate. And it may sound like a distinction without a difference, but it actually really, because of compounding, really does matter. So that, I would say, there are other things kind of around the periphery, but that sort of is really kind of the crux of the issue is around spending. Now, interestingly, of course, Biden said we're not going to negotiate around spending. He will still characterize this as a budget deal and then the debt ceiling separate. But of course, we all know that truly is a distinction without a difference as it relates to the markets.
Just so that I understand, so that just getting to that whole baseline. So let's say 2022 Congress authorized spending for $100, right? Multiply that by as many zeros you want, $100. For 2023, they wanted to increase it, let's say, to 105. And 2024, let's say, increase it to 110, right? But right now they're saying, you know what, we want to freeze levels at about 100. And Democrats are saying, no, we want to freeze levels at 105 and slow the growth of that, in the future.
Exactly. So Democrats are saying, hey, let's just use that 105 as kind of the baseline. So we'll just freeze spending from there, and that will be kind of our starting point. And then we will slow the growth of spending from that 105. Republicans are saying, no, let's start at 100, and then we'll also slow the growth of the spending. But that is a distinction, right? Or that is a difference because, of course, that means you go from 105 to 100, so that does amount to some actual short-term cuts. And as we're looking just from an economic perspective, we're looking into sort of going into the end of 2023 into 2024. Our view is that the economy will likely slow. And this could be yet another headwind if there are cuts. And these cuts would be quite incremental. And again, because, not to get on my soapbox here, but if really Congress wanted to actually do something about the fiscal trajectory of this country, they would have to tackle entitlements. They have to tackle Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid. And nobody wants to do that, right? I mean, particularly Medicare and Social Security. That is sort of the third rail in politics right now on both sides of the aisle. So that is a non-starter. And as a result, they kind of are just nibbling around the edges in terms of spending.
It's amazing. Like Medicare's off the table, Social Security is off the table, Medicaid's, I guess, off the table, defense is off the table, tax increase is off the table. I mean,
It kind of makes it hard to negotiate a budget deal when basically you're taking everything off the table. And the thing is, I mean, and people have their own ideological view about government spending and what have you. And I think it is really easy to sort of see these numbers and say this just kind of goes into an abyss. But, when the national parks are being cut back or meat inspections are being, curtailed. I mean, some of this does. Now, is there waste in government? Like I would say, yes, of course, for sure. But there are, this non-defense discretionary, which is a bunch of words, but it does amount to something in terms of the government is actually spending money on real things that actually impact, real voters.
So, Libby, that was great. Again, Sonu and Ryan are joined by Libby Cantrill of PIMCO to talk about all things policy, mainly the debt ceiling this week on Facts versus Feelings. Libby, we talked about what the Democrats want, what the Republicans want. You know what I want? I want water that works. Here's where I'm going at. This morning at 6 a.m, my wife's like, the water doesn't work. And I'm like, first thing, oh no, did I not pay the bill? Because there was a time 2 years ago I forgot to pay our water bill. And let me tell you, she was not happy for 2 days when we had water because I screwed up. I paid the bill. Apparently our whole neighborhood didn't have water. And it is 2:00 in the afternoon. We still don't have water. So that's what I want. First world problems. But let's get some water. All right, so Libby, but let's get on task here. One of the things Sonu and I kicked around with our partners, our advisors, call them partners. The U.S. does it this way, where Congress gets a vote on the debt ceiling, along with who's the other country? I just want to blank.
Denmark.
Denmark.
Yeah.
Why is it that Denmark and us are the only two that do it this way? I don't know. I'd love to hear your opinion on why that is.
Well, the genesis of the debt limit was, back during World War I, when we started kind of first issuing debt to pay for our military expenditures. And it's been kind of increasingly weaponized. The 1970s, it became, I think, more of an actual kind of hard limit where Congress had to actually vote for it. And then, as I said, kind of increasingly weaponized over the last, 40, 50 years. I was actually heartened to know back in 1979, there was a big debt ceiling standoff. And actually, if you remember, that was, there's been some, talk about whether we've actually already defaulted once before. In 1979 was when it was so last minute that they ended up coming to a deal before the X date, if you will, but then it was so last minute that they weren't actually able to put out the payments because of the archaic systems at the time. So I was actually kind of encouraged by that. Okay, well, maybe 2023 we're not so broken, because apparently in 1979 we were having the same.
Been there, done that, right? Libby, you mentioned X date. So when is X? So X date is the day Treasury runs out of money, basically, which is crazy.
Yes.
It sounds crazy to even say that the U.S. Treasury runs out of money. So when do you expect X date is? And do you think we'll get what do you think are the odds of getting a deal before that? Before
the X date. Yeah. So Secretary Yellen now has tripled down on June 1st being the X date. And right now, it's May 23rd. And so basically right around the corner. Now, she's as Treasury secretaries are inclined to do, very careful with the way that she's worded this. She has said the X date could fall as soon as June 1st. So kind of gives more of a window. Other folks and in some of our modeling shows that it might be a little bit later than that, maybe June 8th. I'm not sure we want to test that hypothesis though, whether, now interestingly, I was actually just on the call with one of our short-term traders, and there's quite a big auction that Treasury has to announce on Thursday. He thinks that if June 1st really is the X date, that they will punt on announcing the size of that, because that is an indication that they really just don't know whether they could actually honor the June 1st obligation. So that I actually think on Thursday, on May 25th, could be a good inflection point to really know how real that X date is. I will say that most negotiators are treating that seriously, although today there's been a bit of pushback by some Republicans kind of questioning the veracity of that X date. As you all know, but it's just as a reminder to folks listening, June 15th is, if we can get kind of to June 15th, that's another big inflection point, if you will, for incoming revenues. That's when a lot of estimated taxes due and corporate taxes are due. So if we can kind of hobble along to June 15th, then honestly, then you get a bunch of revenue coming in, and then you have another sort of reset of extraordinary measures at the end of June. So then you could actually get to sort of August, meaning that our whole summer could be ruined by the time.
And then we do this again.
I'm actually hoping that they don't get to June 15th and that they get this resolved before then. But to your question about, will they get it resolved? Again, I was optimistic last week. I don't think we're going to default. I just, nobody on the Hill has any political incentive. There's obviously some rhetoric indicating that they do, but they really just don't. We already know just from some kind of real-time polling that older people are concerned about Social Security payments not being honored. Older people vote, and older people write letters to members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. So I just think that this is not in anyone's political best interest, not to mention, obviously, the market impact and the question about the dollar being the reserve currency, all the other unintended consequences that come from it. So I continue to be confident that we will get something before the X date, whether that's a short-term extension of the X date or an actual deal. We could also get both. We could get a short-term extension announced at the same time as a framework for a deal. So it sort of placates the market, but it actually practically gives the bill writers some time to actually put pen to paper.
So that was something I wanted to point. Art Cashin, big fan of Art at UBS. He's been saying what you just talked about. If we can get to a certain point, there's more tax revenue coming in. Maybe we can punt this a little bit more. Talk to the listeners. What does that mean? I mean, that's just more money from corporations, individuals. We get some more money and we just punt it. Is that how that works?
Yeah, it's just basically then you don't necessarily need to sort of issue new debt because you have these revenues to come in to then pay off your obligations on the liability side. Again, we do not want this. We do not want this. The collective, we do not want this because we want to have our summer free of the debt ceiling. Yes. And I will say this is important actually because as part of I'm trying to will this into existence. Okay, so
we will too.
One more quick one for me. I mean, June 1st is obviously potentially X date. June 2nd, the first Friday of June is National Donut Day. So, Libby, here's to this getting settled. We can all celebrate National Donut Day in style. What's your favorite donut? What's your favorite donut place or favorite donut, Libby? What's your on June 2nd? You're going to celebrate how? What are you going to get?
I like a Boston cream. I have Dunkin' Donuts right around the corner.
Okay.
Go here in New York. I will sometimes sneak over around and get a Boston cream donut. It's pretty good.
Nice.
Sounds good to me. Yeah, good.
What do you guys like?
I'm a chocolate. Yeah. Everything's chocolate for me. So, but I have a Dunkin' Donuts down the corner for me in Chicago. So that's an easy one.
I am a chocoholic as well, but I will say, don't throw anything. I mean, I don't like Dunkin' Donuts that much. No offense. But there's a lot of good donut places out there. But I do like Dunkin'. I do like a donut. So, yeah.
I think yuppie donuts.
Yeah,
like $10 donut.
Yeah.
The gourmet donut for Ryan.
Yeah. That's right.
But so, well, hopefully, it seems like the perennial headline, anything related to government, is government punts again. But hopefully they don't get to punt it this time. So let's talk worst case, right? Like if they don't get a deal, what happens then? Let's just go with that. What happens next if they don't get a deal by X date?
So there's been a lot of talk about the president invoking the 14th Amendment, which is there's this, one sentence in the 14th Amendment, a partial sentence basically saying that that we will not do anything to not honor the public debt. And so some constitutional scholars have interpreted that as that actually President Biden should just go on, invoke the 14th Amendment, ignore the debt ceiling, and keep issuing debt. I think the markets would have a big issue with that because that would then be litigated to the Supreme Court, and then there would be a lot of uncertainty. But I also think politically, this is something that President Biden just will not do. He is a legislator at heart, even though the student loan stuff that he did was kind of abrogated Congress. But for the most part, I think he really does kind of respect the role of Congress here. He has said over and over again, it is the sort of statutory obligation of Congress to increase the debt ceiling. Yellen has repeated that as well. So even if hopefully your Twitter is less insane than mine is, but my Twitter is going off the rails about the 14th Amendment and the, the platinum coin and, the
perpetual bonds.
Zero coupon bond, exactly. I would just fade all of those, right? That is just politically not going to be an alternative. So what happens if we do default? I think Yellen sort of alluded to this earlier this week, when she, basically said hard choices will have to be made. The only document that we really have from the Treasury Department is after 2011, when the Inspector General did a report basically about what the plan was for Treasury. It wasn't necessarily, they didn't necessarily indicate that they would prioritize bond payments, but that they would make sort of payments as they received revenue. So they would, as you sort of receive, the Treasury is obviously receiving revenue all of the time in terms of tax receipts and what have you. So as they receive the revenue, then they would pay the obligation that's sort of in front of the queue, if you will. So they did not indicate that they would prioritize bond payments or interest payments or what have you. I think our view is they probably would if they had to, but it puts the Treasury in a very difficult position because they really aren't supposed to be making fiscal decisions, right? The fiscal authority really does rest with Congress, not with Treasury. So I think they're going to be loath to do that as well. And then, of course, the first missed Social Security payment or delayed Social Security payment, that's not going to go well. So this is why I just feel like you take this to a logical conclusion. It seems so politically bad, to use a technical term, for members of Congress. They just don't think they can they won't actually let it go. Again, everyone's political incentive to wait until the 11th hour to make some concessions, but no one's political incentive to actually go over and breach the debt limit.
And at the end of the day, it's just Biden and McCarthy, right? Can they just get into a room and sort it out? It seems like, compared to 12 years ago, it feels like there's a lot more tension around, the White House and Congress right now. Like every time Speaker McCarthy goes into the White House, he comes out like, oh, I had a very good conversation with Biden. And, everyone's a little more optimistic. And then their staff meet and it seems like the optimism goes away. But But what's
Yeah.
going? Can they just get into a room and solve this?
I think that is what Speaker McCarthy wants. I think he wants to be negotiating with the president of the United States, right? It's like pretty good for his stature to be negotiating directly with the president. And I think that is what he wants. I think, Democrats, and this was a false calculus or misplaced calculus because hasn't been realized, but I think they thought, well, we'll get McConnell and Biden into a room. They negotiated the 2011 debt ceiling deal. They negotiated the fiscal cliff back in 2012. You guys remember that? They had been sort of at the center of many negotiations. So like get those, old guys in a room and they'll kind of hammer this out. And then McConnell was like, nope, I'm deferring to McCarthy. And that was that. I mean, he's a ultimate tactician. And that was a really smart move, honestly, politically, because that really strengthened McCarthy's hand with the president. And basically, McConnell said, yeah, the Republican Senate caucus is with you. We are insisting on negotiating as well. So he didn't undermine McCarthy's position. I think just if you look at kind of the game theory of all of this, that was all quite critical. Anyway, this is probably boring for everybody else except for me, but in terms of talking about political strategy here. But I do think that ultimately it will take, Biden and McCarthy. And then if push comes to shove, like if we are really getting to a point where there is absolutely no movement on this, then I do think McConnell enters the scene. So I do think watch that, right? Kind of watch for if McConnell starts, and whether it's public or whether it's private. I mean, he even reiterated today that everyone needed to relax and that nobody was going to default on the debt. So he sort of, I think he's kind of trying to take the temperature down a little bit. And I do think that his, the bunny in the hat, if you will, is sort of the McConnell kind of appearing on stage right and entering the negotiations.
So we have about 5 minutes left. It's not lost on us, Libby, how busy you are. So we want to make sure we hit our marks. But this has been so interesting. Let's change gears a little bit. I think we've covered the debt ceiling and everything really well. Let's talk about the upcoming election next year. I know last time you were on, we talked about, President Biden, maybe he wouldn't run. I know he's saying, right, he's going to run. Do you still think he's going to run, or what's your feeling on the upcoming election?
Yeah, well, he's running. And,
he's running. Okay.
And as of now, he's running. And short of, regardless of what you kind of think of him, love him or hate him, no one wishes any poor health on him. But short of poor health, short of stroke, he's going to run. So we should all assume that he will be the candidate for the Democrats. He will not be primaried. This is not 1980, right, when Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter and, Ted Kennedy thought Jimmy Carter was vulnerable. So that will not happen. This is he will have a lane completely freed, and it will be Kamala Harris. She will be on the ticket. So that, I think, for all intents and purposes, is set, again, outside of some sort of extraordinary circumstance. On the Republican side, though, of course, there's been, lots of narratives. And I would just say to folks who are listening, just beware of narratives this early on. Beware of polling this early on, the head-to-head polling in terms of a general election matchup, the head-to-head polling in a primary matchup. It's all kind of garbage at this point. It really is not an indicator of, who's either going to be the nominee or going to be the president. So I would sort of fade it, kind of ignore it at this point, because it really is just kind of gobbledygook. What should people focus on, though? August, I think, is going to be an important inflection point, because that's the first debate on the Republican side. It looks like it's going to be a pretty crowded field, right? Governor DeSantis is entering the race on tomorrow. Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina, entered yesterday. We have Asa Hutchinson and Nikki Haley. Of course, we have former President Trump. And then we're probably going to get other folks. Kristen Sonu from New Hampshire is considering running. Now we know Glenn Youngkin might be considering running. He's the governor of Virginia. He sort of said he wouldn't be running, but now he might be running. Anyway, it might be a crowded field. So August, I think, is sort of when you sort of start to see that field really kind of gel. Who is going to be, running for the Republican nomination? November is another important date, because that's the last possible time that somebody can jump into the race. So think of that as sort of the end point in terms of, like, once November passes, then basically the field is going to be set on the Republican side. And then, of course, the Republican primaries begin February 5th. And it's actually a caucus in Iowa. And then that starts, weekly, if not semi-weekly primaries and caucuses. So those are kind of the things I would just sort of focus on. Again, all the head-to-head polling, I think, is kind of garbage at this point. What I think is actually, and this is like pretty weedy, but it's really important, is the kind of the way that delegates are allocated on the Republican side. This is
I
when
was going to
everyone
ask you about this.
But this is actually really important, and it's more important than the polls at this point. And the reason it's important is because we don't, of course, have a federal election system in this country. The primaries are dictated by the respective parties. The Democrats allocate delegates, so you have to get a number of delegates in order to win the nomination on each side, right. Republican and Democrat. The Democrats allocate delegates on what's called a proportional basis. So if you win 30% of delegates, say, and Sonu, you're in Illinois, then you get 30% of the vote, you get 30% of the delegates. On the Republican side, though, if Illinois, and it may very well be, is a winner-take-all state, if you win 30% of the delegates, and that's more than 30% of the vote, and that's more than any other the candidates. So say Trump wins 30% of the vote, DeSantis wins 25% of the vote. In a winner-take-all state, Trump will win 100% of the delegates. And that is what happened in 2016. That was the way that he was able to win such a formidable lead early on and basically clear the lane. And so if it's a crowded field yet again, and President Trump is getting about 30% of the support, and the balance, that 70% of the support is split across many other candidates, I think that, and because of this winner-take-all dynamic, President Trump could once again be the nominee. And again, the Republicans decide this on a state-by-state basis. If you look at the winner-take-all states in 2024, it looks like there'll be more than there were in 2016, meaning that this dynamic may be even more pronounced. So I just flagged that for people because that I think is actually much more important than the polling, is sort of this winner-take-all dynamic. And again, a crowded field where, the balance of the candidates are sort of splitting the vote, President Trump could also, again, rise to the top. But it's way too early to say that, right? He has some legal issues and other things that are going on. And I just think it's way too early to say whether he's going to be the nominee or not.
Well, I think it's safe to say if you're okay with it, in 6 months we'll have you back. You'll be the first 3-time guest to this because there's going to be a lot to talk about. We've unfortunately this is the fastest 30 minutes I think we've ever done. Libby, I have one more for you. Hopefully it's a fun one, an easy one. When you were on last time, we talked about your son. I believe he was going into student council or going to try to run, or you're pushing him for. What's the update in your family for student council with your son? How's that looking?
No, thank you for asking. Well, actually, so he won. His house,
there you go.
Home representative.
Awesome.
He's thinking about maybe running for secretary next year, but he may be able to run for vice president the following year. So he's doing a little game theory. He thinks it's better to stay a House representative next year, stay with the people, stay close to them, and then run for vice president. I will also say, and this, I hope I'm not alienating any listeners, we're huge Denver Nuggets fans. And last night we were thinking about how do we get Teddy and I, how are we going to watch the Nuggets play in the finals? So we are, if anyone knows any good connection, we might be going down to Miami.
Hey, people listen to this podcast. There you go.
Never know.
That's good. That's true. So congrats to the Nuggets. That's true. That's my one son said Nuggets in 4. Gus, my youngest son, said Nuggets in 4. My older son's like, you're crazy. But anyway, he woke up this morning, told you Nuggets in 4, and now he's saying Nuggets in 5. So we'll see. But good luck. Well, Libby, thank you. There you go. There you go. Well, Libby, thank you so much for joining us on the 35th episode of Carson's Facts versus Feelings with Ryan and Sonu. This was an awesome discussion. It's the number one question we've been getting from our partners and their clients. We know you are super busy, so it means a lot to us. You could take an hour out of your day or so to sit down and talk with us and have some fun, and we did. And we look forward to you joining us the third time. Maybe we can talk about that Republican, who's going to be the president for the Republicans in November. That'll be good. So, all right. Thank you, Libby. Appreciate it today. Take care.
Thanks so much, guys. Appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you.
Information provided on Facts versus Feelings with Sonu Varghese and Ryan Detrick are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. The statements and opinions of show guests may not be reflective of CWM LLC or its affiliates. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested in directly. Investing involves risk, including possible loss of principal. No strategy assures success or protects against loss. To determine what may be appropriate for you, consult with your attorney, accountant, financial or tax advisor prior to investing. Guests on Facts versus Feelings are not affiliated with CWM LLC.